Now, usually I take 2 or 3 passages from the lectionary readings for Sunday, and I try to explain as best I can how I believe God is speaking to us in our time through those ancient words. And there are many stories in the Bible that mean at first less to us than they did to ancient people, because they contain details, references, background that modern people simply don't have. So this morning I'm just going to take this one story of the Samaritan woman at the well and just go through it. And I could have easily have come up with half a dozen sermons out of this passage. You'd be relieved to know I've only got one this morning. This story of Jesus speaking with the Samaritan woman at the well is not only a lengthy story, but it's full of details that people today might not notice. And as we go through the story, I want you to ask yourself, what does the woman want? And then ask, what is it that I want? And note also, as we look at the woman's responses, that at first she's defiant. And then in turn she's sarcastic, defensive, curious, and finally she's transformed. And this is the only time in the New Testament that Jesus comes out, straight out, and says that he is the Messiah. There are other places where he suggests it, but never quite comes out with it himself, leaving it to listeners to use the eyes of faith to reach their own conclusion. But here he says it, and he does it to a Samaritan woman. And what's so odd about that? Well, Jews and Samaritans really didn't like each other. You see, back in about 597 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took about 30,000 Jews and brought them to Babylon in exile. These were the leaders, especially the priests, the wealthier people. And he did this because they refused to pay tribute to him. So he takes all the leaders of Israel off to Babylon. Now there were many more Jews that were left behind, as well as relative newcomers to the area, the Samaritans. The Jews regarded the Samaritans as having a thin veneer of Judaism over their old heathen beliefs. So for 55 years, these people and the Jews who had been left leaderless lived there side by side and probably took a few ideas from each other. And then, 55 years later, the other Jews returned from exile. Now, while they were in Babylon, they picked up some Mesopotamian ideas as well, like the idea of hell comes from the exile. And then when they, not only is their religion changed a bit in the time, but when they get back home, they find a very different kind of Judaism. And both sides, the Samaritans who had stayed and the Jews who returned, said that they had the real faith and they were unable to come to terms. So they decided apparently that the best thing to do was to hate each other. Violence towards Jewish travelers in Samaria was not uncommon. This sort of thing has been going on for a long time. So the Jews didn't talk to Samaritans. In fact, they had as little to do with Samaritans as possible. Not only that, it was not culturally acceptable for a man to speak to a woman that he didn't know. And on top of this, we find out, as the story progresses, that this is a woman of ill repute. She's had all these husbands. She's living with somebody who's not her husband. She's probably had a lot of kids. We aren't told for sure, but 5 husbands. You got to figure. She has a disorderly life. In short, she's the kind of woman a Jewish rabbi didn't speak to. Now here's Jesus, a rabbi, walking from Judea to Galilee, passing through Samaria. That's the West Bank, where the Palestinians are now. That was Samaria. And the trail he's taking is a steep one, a rough one, and it's through unfriendly territory. It's the middle of the day, it's hot, he's tired and thirsty. And he comes to Sychar and sits at Jacob's well. Jacob's well is still there, 7.5 feet diameter. The scripture says it's deep. It's 135 feet deep through primarily limestone. It's now surrounded by an Eastern Orthodox monastery. So, the Samaritan woman comes down to the well to draw water. Why'd you do that? Why'd you draw water at that well? Because there were and are still streams of flowing water in the vicinity of Sychar and the well. But this is a sacred well. It's been associated with Jacob for centuries. And so this is also the perfect place for the discourse that's about to happen. And there's something else that's unusual about this. When would you normally go to get water? This is the desert. I mean, I remember when I was up on the Kuskokwim River in the Athabascan village in winter, you went out to gather water, that is, to chip the hole in the ice and get your bucket down there in the middle of the day because it was warm. In the desert, you do that in the cool of the morning or the cool of the evening. Why is she going there in the middle of the day, the hottest time of day? Well, the reason she's doing that is that nobody else is there. She dislikes the stares, the whispers, the gossip that happens when she's around others. Whenever the villagers see her. But there is Jesus, who asks her for water, apparently not caring that she is a Samaritan, and she can tell just by the way he's dressed that he's a Jew. Now think for a moment about all the encounters that Jesus has with people in the New Testament. What initially draws them to him? Now, sometimes it's what he gives them, sometimes it's what he promises, sometimes it's his growing reputation, but many times it's what he asks them. And think of the questions he asks people. Do you want to be healed? Why are you afraid? Do you not yet understand? What are you thinking in your hearts? These are questions that get at people. But here he simply asks for water. Now this is in the desert. It's in the Middle East. Hospitality is kind of a sacred thing there. And so he knows that he will receive water. And he knows that she won't turn him down. But she is surprised because he is a Jew asking. She says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? And Jesus answers her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And she misunderstands, because living water can also mean running water. And there are streams around here. And that running water is probably purer than what's sitting in the well. And here she becomes defiant. She takes this as an insult to the patriarch Jacob. And she says essentially, what this Samaritan water isn't good enough for you Jews? And Jesus explains, those who drink of the water I will give them will never be thirsty. He said, take a drink of water. Now in Jeremiah, God himself is the fountain of living water. Water is the symbol of the satisfaction of all man's greatest needs. This water is the free gift from God. It's eternal spiritual water. Now the Samaritan woman answers, essentially, great, I'll never have to haul water again. Now she's being sarcastic. And also, like so many people, her mind has turned immediately to material things. What's going to make my life easier? She's expecting that something will happen that will improve her physical condition and that will make her more happy. But her life needs healing. And it's only from the spiritual that healing is going to come. So Jesus now brings her heart up against the facts of her life. Go call your husband and come back. Now he knows what's going on. And she has to say, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, yeah, you had 5, and number 6 isn't married to you. So now the woman becomes defensive. She tries to evade what Jesus is saying by turning the discussion away from that into a discussion of the way we worship versus the way you worship. This is religiosity, exchanging meaningless form for true faith. And Jesus uses this attempt to evade an awkward reality to proclaim a message of universal salvation. It will not matter who we are, Samaritan or Jew, or where we worship, our sacred mountain, your sacred mountain, Jerusalem, Samaria, all that doesn't matter. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in truth and spirit. True faith, not religiosity, but worship in spirit and truth. So now she's curious. And she says, he's kind of getting it, and she says, I know that the Messiah is coming, and he's going to tell us everything. And that's when Jesus reveals to her, as he does to no other, I who speak to you, and I am the Messiah. And the word astounds her because they have the ring of truth. She recognizes it. She experiences through Jesus in that instant the voice of God speaking to her without judgment, speaking to her only with love. She runs back to Sychar, leaving her water jug behind. Now, is this a real story or not? I don't believe this was a story made up for the gospel. I think someone witnessed this. And in fact, we only know there were 2 people there. So my suspicion is that this story was spread by the woman herself. And this detail, the water jar, gives it a real ring of authenticity. Modern writers are told to make things really, to include all these little details. That's not something they did back then. But leaving the water jar she's in such a hurry to get back to her village to tell them what's happened, that she leaves the water jar behind. The very thing she went down for in the first place, she just leaves it. She can't be bothered. Besides, what immediate need does she have for water? Jesus has just given her the water of life. In that instant, she is transformed, and she runs back to tell all her neighbors. Now, minutes ago, the village despised her and gossiped about her. Now she's anxious to see the very people she's avoided for so many years. She's gone to the well when they weren't there. She's been hiding from them. She's been hiding from the realities of her own life. What had become of her? But they see this amazing change in her because of her very faults. Because of those faults. That's what makes her transformation astounding. These faults had prepared her to bear witness to Christ in a way she could not have done otherwise. And they become converted as well. Now the disciples had thought they were just going to be stopping there for a drink of water, and they'd gone off to get some food and have a little lunch. Turns out they stayed in Sychar for 2 days. And everybody there spends that 2 days listening to Jesus. And many more become saved. God works in ways we don't expect. But those people would not have been saved, had not been transformed without the transformation of that woman. Now her continuing, well, there's a tradition about her that she was baptized, given the name Fotini, and her continuing witness to Christ is said to have brought so many people to Christ that she was called the equal of the apostles, and she was eventually martyred at the hands of the Emperor Nero. So as we've considered this story, ask yourself now, what is it that you shy away from in your own past? What would you rather that others not know about you? I've got things like that in my past. We all do. Might that not have given you a better understanding of your need for Christ? And might that not have prepared you to be a better witness to Christ? And are you and I so full of the Spirit, living and worshiping in spirit and truth, that others will turn to us, look at us and say, I want what they want? Do we understand that God is seeking us out? That He seeks such as us to worship Him? That He loves us just as we are? And He offers each one of us a drink of the living water from God's fountain.